You are watching programming from the East-West Center in Washington, D.C.
Well, good morning, everyone. Good afternoon and good evening for our speakers, Dr. Pardo in Brussels and Dr. June Park in Korea. We realize, particularly for June, it's late in the evening there, but thank you both for joining. My name is Satu Lemay, and welcome to the East-West Center in Washington's 60 Minutes for the 60th Anniversary series of webinars. We're absolutely delighted to have with us Dr. June Park, who was a former Asia Studies visiting fellow here in Washington, and Dr. Ramon Pardo, who is a colleague of ours working with us on a number of projects relating to EU, Korea, and the US. So both of you, welcome. Today's topic is absolutely fascinating and incredibly topical because it fuses together a number of threads of contemporary policy relevant issues. Response to COVID, obviously, how different democratic societies are using tracking applications, what this might mean for digitization and AI cooperation, what it means for democratic governance and norms related to the use of technology in open societies. So it just really does fuse together a number of very, very interesting and highly policy relevant topics. And I can't think of two better people to come at this from a range of issues. As you know from your material for this event, Dr. June Park is a next generation research fellow at the National Research Foundation of Korea. She was a former Fulbright scholar as a PhD candidate at Boston University, where she received her PhD, has been in Singapore at the Lee Kuan Yew School, and really works at the nexus of comparative political economies. So delighted to have June. Thank you so much for doing this. And of course, Dr. Pardo is the chair in Brussels, holds the Korea chair at the university. And as you can see from his bio, he brings a wealth of experience both in Europe and in Korea and in Asia. He sits on the board of a number of highly regarded publications, and we're delighted to have him with us because he's a particular expert on issues related to trade and Korea-EU relations, including the EU-Korea FTA. So with that, I just want to welcome all of our participants, thank the speakers, and what they're going to do is June, I understand, has approximately a 30-minute PowerPoint, which he will take us through. And then we'll invite Dr. Pardo to please give us some remarks, some questions, and then we'll open it up from the floor. You saw the protocol. Please follow those Q&A section. And forgive me, but I will read the questions for two reasons. One, we are a live stream on YouTube, and they cannot see the questions if you're watching a live stream on YouTube. And therefore, if I read the questions, they'll know the context in which Dr. Park and Dr. Pardo are responding. And the second reason is very simple. It avoids June and Ramon having to constantly look down and scroll through the Q&A. And by doing that, it gives them a minute or two to think. But I know they're such terrific fast thinkers that they'll be right on top of the comments and questions. With that, fire away, June. It's your platform. It's your webinar for the next 30 minutes, please.
Okay, so I will share screen. So thank you everyone for joining. It is late here, but in DC, I understand it's morning. I have prepared these slides in celebration of the 10th EU-ROK relationship, strategic partnership, as well as the 60th anniversary of the East-West Center. And I'm very delighted to be part of this seminar. Thank you for inviting me. So today what we're going to go through is sort of dissecting how countries have come about differently in terms of their COVID-19 responses in the digital realm. And the reason why I got very much interested in this as a political economist is because we have a brewing transatlantic trade war that is coming, and also because the contactless environment that I've mentioned in my Asia Pacific Bulletin is really real, and it's coming to us whether we like it or not. So with that, let's start off. Overview-wise, I'm going to throw the research question and explain what's at stake very briefly before I delve into the conceptual framework and the argument and some findings that you might find really interesting. Then I will shift over to policy implications, and perhaps in the Q&A session and the discussion with Ramon, maybe we could have more food for thought. So the research question is very basic. Should conditional and temporary use of personal data be allowed for tracking COVID-19? And here, in terms of personal data, I mean GPS data. And Bluetooth contact tracing method that has been discussed in the context of Corona app development in Europe, and Apple and Google cooperating to provide the API for this kind of method, it's brought about a lot of discussions because regardless of what method has been taken by countries, we haven't seen that much of efficacy or efficiency, if you would call it, in Europe with regard to these apps. It's been about a month since they have been launched. The first apps were launched in early June, and Germany launched it on June 15th. So we're about a month from then. And this past week has been very, very eventful in Europe, transatlantic relations when it comes to tech issues. Apple won big. They don't have to pay a huge sum of the tax in Ireland. And the day right after the EU court rules against data transfers to the United States. And these surveillance concerns keep on rising up, surfacing each time in transatlantic relations. And I'd like to sort of take you through why that is so controversial in Europe. Basically, data acquisition and data privacy enables artificial intelligence. Whether we want to see this happen or not is another issue, but the way it works through tech and the platforms that they provide us to use, privacy issues are always at stake, and ethics, of course. The legal framework that the European Union has provided is GDPR and the e-policy directive, and the digital single market that we would discuss pretty soon. And then there is the financing issue. But when it comes to health issues in an contactless environment, we would see these kinds of evolution of data usage in the future, whether we like it or not. And the use of big data in that regard, which enables artificial intelligence, will occur fast in some other countries, and in others, probably more slower, in a slower pace. So what's at stake right now? Europe is going through the digital transformation and in part discussions on artificial intelligence, but we know very well that in the United States, because of the role of the big tech firms, GAFA, things are a little bit different in the United States with regard to data usage. GDPR has been in effect since May 2018, and basically it sort of embodies the rights of the natural person in terms of individual rights to protect his or her own data as a natural person. And as I mentioned earlier on, the e-privacy directive or the digital single market issues are in part targeting GAFA because there is an overreaching behavior seen from the European side by these American tech firms coming onto the European region. Then there's the debate on personal data protection and public health safety that have arisen because of Corona, the COVID-19. These apps that we are going to discuss had to be GDPR compliant no matter what in order to be up and running. And because the discussion was so much centering on GDPR compliance itself, we got sort of lost in the the efficacy discussion, whether it actually works, whether it can track, whether it can actually contain the virus. And GPS data in that regard has been very controversial because it is very personal. It's under GDPR, it would be a personal, very, very private data. Eventually, Google and Apple provided the API source code for app development, but that was also controversial in some cases, and some countries decided to go with the API that they provided, some countries not. So let's delve into the transatlantic trade war and a few other slides. But before we do that, let me just outline some of the important articles in the GDPR. So as I mentioned, there's the data protection capacity, compliance has to be ensured, started ticking off, and data breaches and personal data. These are the main detections. The role of the GDPR is to detect these and to punish. And the weight that it carries legally is so powerful that if a company is found in breach of GDPR, up to 20 million euros can be fined, or whichever is greater in terms of what is punishable in terms of amount. And what's really special of this law is the regulation is that it also applies to non-EU companies that are operating in the European Union or collects the data of EU citizens. So here there's a plot here regarding which articles of the GDPR collects the most fines, and I think this is very interesting. And the article that I'd like you to pay attention to is Article 6, lawful processing of personal data with consent, basically with consent. There are other articles that come into question, such as Article 9 or Article 5, but basically the discussion is centered around, and the usage of these apps, they are centered around Article 6. And the examples of violation are numerous, but let me just point out a few. GDPR violation, Article 6 violation. Currently, the discussion on these tech firms, American tech firms, in breach of GDPR, it's been ongoing for a while now. And in the recent case, British Airways was proposed a fine, which is very, very astronomical in terms of corporate fine. That was for Article 32, security of processing. And into the transatlantic sort of trade war sort of perspective that I mentioned earlier on. The USMCA has gone into effect. As most of you know, in Washington, this has been very, very widely discussed. And the USMCA contains one of the most comprehensive rules on digital trade that we've ever seen in not just in the digital realm, but sort of in the tech sort of sphere. It's so new and something that is so unprecedented that when a trade political economist like myself sees this, this is what the US is advocating for in order to go forward with the US tech companies. And you could see similar arrangements in the US-Japan trade agreement, which was signed last year in October and which went into effect early this year. And when you look deeply into the digital trade mechanisms of the USMCA, and if you compare that to the EU data protection reform, things are a little bit, not just a little bit, but completely at odds with regard to data processing or how to treat data, what kind of data to collect with consent or not. The US basically advocates for internet freedom, and the EU certainly does not. So the conceptual framework for this specific project on COVID-19 that I have, the real intent for this project is to really delve into how Europe varies by country, even amongst member states in terms of policymaking, and who's the dominant player in each jurisdiction when it comes to tech decisions, what kind of policy preferences, and what does it actually mean for an AI-driven future in coming years? And what we need to examine in the Corona app case are the following. whether they went with a centralized option or a decentralized option, with Google and Apple provided API or not. GDPR compliance, was it enough? Were there enough considerations for public health safety? And while the Council of Europe, sorry, not the Commission, Council of Europe asks member states for revision options on the Article 6 of GDPR, whether these kinds of discussions are substantial in many of the member states is really a question. And then there is the download rate that's been so controversial, not many, so varied by jurisdiction, but public participation proved to be pretty low in terms of the rate per population of the entire jurisdiction in many countries. And there is the question of efficacy there. So putting that all into a perspective, and since I'm going to be suggesting or proposing the idea that temporary conditional use of data should be allowed, let me just go through the argument very quickly and delve into the findings in a moment. So first of all, conditional use in the context of national health emergencies, I think it's very, very vital in a crisis like this. They can increase efficacy in COVID-19, but one thing to note is that each European society, each jurisdiction must decide first on what kind of society that they would like to have in terms of going about tracking COVID-19 and in terms of data processing, collection and processing. And as I mentioned earlier on, tech wars are going to be exacerbated because of the differing views across the Atlantic on how data should be collected and data should be, privacy of the data should be protected. And regrettably, the contactless environment is here to stay. So there has to be some kind of policy design in this regard. And what I suggest is revising the GDPR to accommodate for these national emergency cases for data collection and processing, if it can actually work towards saving the lives of EU citizens. Then the digital proficiency issue is also something that should be worked on. It should focus not just on disbanding of data collection, but the balance of utility and risks of AI, both sides, in order to raise public awareness and to foster public participation in Europe. So delving quickly into the findings, here is a breakdown of what I've been able to find in terms of comparing the South Korean EU discussion, EU member states, Germany and France notably, and then the discussion in the UK. And I've broken these down into the sources and the nature of these apps, but also how they came about the decision and under what kind of law, under what kind of experiences in each country, whether it's GDPR compliant, contact tracing method, what kind of system, is it centralized or decentralized? Is it based on what kind of data, GPS data, credit card history, or is it just Bluetooth? Then who is the source code provider? That's also something to question, right? So all of these factors come into discussion because there is no single answer to coming up with COVID-19 tracking in this world right now. So as you will see in the videos, two footages that I would show you, for South Korea, because South Korea already has gone through the Middle East respiratory syndrome 5 years ago, which is also a coronavirus. The Infectious Disease Prevention and Control Act was revised in order to accommodate these kinds of data processing. That's so crucial. And in addition to the Personal Information Protection Act, this has been so central to the response that was brought about this time around. In the EU case, GDPR, first and foremost, was so important, but countries went about their own ways, as I mentioned in the APB. And GDPR was also very present in Germany and France's adoption of their own coronavirus tracking methods. But they varied in terms of whether they would adopt the API from Apple and Google or not. And both are compliant in their GDPR compliances, but the kind of articles that are used a little bit different. And in the French case, French national law was also embodied. And right now there is discussion in Germany regarding Germany's own Corona app law. And similar discussions are brewing in the UK as well in terms of adopting a digital law just for COVID apps, because this is so controversial and each country has a different idea. So social contract is what South Korea had achieved 5 years ago. The social contract that does not exist right now in Europe would be fostered through discussion and public awareness into the future. So Bluetooth, let me open it up a little bit more into discussion with the videos, but before we do that, the Bluetooth technology that Google and Apple offered as an API source, it's in the French method, France did not opt for Google and Apple because the negotiations had had fallen through. And in Germany's case, at first they wanted to go with it. They wanted to go with their own app, but the centralization method did not really cater to the public's interest. So let's move on a little bit in terms of the policy preferences on Corona apps here. Right now, basically, all these major economies of Europe have been going through in a very short period of time trying to figure out whether they want an independent app. It has to be GDPR compliant. At the same time, Google and Apple would provide those APIs, but would not want to provide the full extent of Bluetooth technology because it would be against their policies of targeted advertising. And now what we see is, independent app or not, the question about efficacy in terms of tracking the COVID-19 is really what's at stake. In the South Korean case, as I mentioned, MERS, Middle East Respiratory Syndrome, the infection toll and the death toll and infection toll were the highest in the world anywhere outside the Middle East, and it was a very shocking experience. And that's why there were institutional changes. And in time too, when this came about, because that kind of institutional change happened, and in the failure to control the virus under Park Geun-hye was so critical to the political life expectancy of Park Geun-hye, what happened was completely delegating it to the health officials. And also the government working with other private entities on public-private partnership in order to achieve the kind of tracking system. This is sort of a breakdown. It's from a peer-reviewed paper that is ongoing, currently being reviewed, co-written with my co-author, Eun-Bin Chung at the University of Utah. And this sort of outlines what kind of changes took place in terms of MERS and COVID-19. During MERS, basically, the Ministry of Health and Welfare was granted the right to collect the kind of data that was required in order to ensure public health safety. And it was renewed one more time, the IDPCA was reviewed one more time so that all citizens, all South Korean citizens would have the right to be tested, real-time PCR testing. And then there are other institutional issues here, but in the interest of time, let's go on and watch this video.
코로나19 역학 조사를 위해서는 확진자의 이동 중점 분석과 감염적 분석이 필수적입니다. 이번에 스마트 시티 기술을 기반으로 개발한 역학조사 지원 시스템은 역학조사에 체계하고 정확하게 많은 도움이 되고 있습니다.
Okay, so what you saw in the video were not these two apps that were developed to check virus exposure or to check on quarantined persons, but rather this smart management system, which is a web-based platform. And before and after is basically before Corona and before the coronavirus and after the coronavirus deployment of the smart management system. So before it was more about, the detective work, but, person to person, but after it was very much expedited, only takes about 10 minutes after getting the permission to inspect the data. And we could delve on this a little bit more, but let's do that in the Q&A and discussion section. And let's move on to check out the Bluetooth-enabled platform that Germany has.
With the Corona Warn app, you can help to interrupt chains of infection. With minimal effort and with maximum data protection. The Corona Warn app does not know who you are, but it can accompany you so that you can better protect yourself and the people around you. Whenever you encounter another user, your smartphones automatically exchange encrypted random codes. These random codes tell the smartphones that people have encountered each other, for how long, and how far apart they were. They disclose neither names nor locations. The other user will therefore never find out their smartphone has exchanged a code with yours. Your identity will remain secret. The codes are deleted from your smartphone after 14 days. If it is proven that a user has been infected, they can choose to anonymously make their random codes available to all other users, and to you as well. Your app finds the code that your phone exchanged with the infected person's smartphone and informs you that you came into contact with them. At the same time, it provides you with clear recommendations for what to do. You will also remain anonymous at all times. The successful fight against the coronavirus can only be won if we work together. You can play your part too. With the Corona Warn app, you protect yourself and those around you.
So what the Google and Apple people have proposed is an anonymous method of tracking COVID-19, but more in the sense that it's GDPR compliant and enabling Bluetooth technology instead of relying on GPS data as South Korea's system had. But remember that South Korea's system is based on the social contract written into law, IDPCA. In the French case, the way in which the Bluetooth app could be working in different kinds of jurisdictions, they vary in terms of whether there is a centralized server or not. And while Germany and Italy and Switzerland and Latvia, these countries, and possibly the UK after adopting the API, goes on with the decentralized option offered by the API by Google and Apple, the French have gone their own way in terms of developing their own app, and it is using a centralized server. But the GDPR compliance was very much stark in the French app, and it explicitly outlines where the data are stored, how the data is used, controlled, and why they are shared. And it very much emphasizes that it is pseudonymized. Now, in the final section of my presentation, I'd like to just touch upon this very useful visualization tool. It was developed by a professor at the University of Illinois, and it basically gives you the breakdown of confirmed cases. And I understand that the United States case is very appalling here, but this is the data that we have post 100 days of the initial patient. And let's just examine the past 1 month while the apps that were released were in function. Of course, the UK doesn't have one. South Korea is a constant because, you know, it flattened the curve earlier on, and although there are cluster infections, basically the smart management system just keeps on controlling the situation. While even with Germany, even with the launch of the app, on the rise, and then slowly as people are more succumbing to the kind of guidelines, even after the launch of the app, it rose and then it started to fall a little bit, and now it's showing a positive curve. Meanwhile, the French app does not really show coherence. There is no way to really tell that this app is adding something in terms of tracking the virus. In the UK, of course, the discussion is still ongoing, so perhaps this curve is not really meaningful. And lastly, I'd like to point to some of the discussions that were ongoing at the Council of the European Union in the previous 2 weeks. And now there is a call to sort of consider the revised version of GDPR in terms of Article 6b, especially when it comes to protecting the vital interest of a natural person in the case of an emergency, in general upon request of a public authority in accordance with the union or member state, etc. And there are other options that are thrown here. The processing of electronic communication metadata should also be regarded as lawful where it is necessary to protect an interest, which is essential for the life of the end user, meaning public health crisis that could actually impact the person. There is also a series of other discussions regarding Article 6 in terms of electronic communications and metadata. And I think that in light of the French app that was released with pseudonymized options, I think this discussion is brewing. So to end, what are the policy implications? COVID-19 is South Korea's Maris moment. South Korea went through it before. And perhaps that's really the reason why South Korea has this public demand of controlling the virus with even the consent of using personal data. Conditional and temporary use of personal data to save lives in public health emergency is very, very necessary. There is policy space for this, but EU member states, again, I underline that they need to come up with their own decisions on how to carry on with the virus, what kind of society they would like to have. It's up to their decision, and their opinions and comments should be delivered to the Council of the European Union in terms of this revision. And I think it's a very, very timely discussion. Again, the digital proficiency that is required in Europe, and policy and coherence. Okay, this is it's a little bit early for this discussion perhaps, but as we've seen in the launch of the Global Partnership on Artificial Intelligence, we can easily say without hesitation that policy and coherence witnessed in this digital tracking method is a prelude to foreseen challenges in deep learning or machine learning and AI, because what we're dealing with these Corona apps right now is not really AI. They're digital tracking of locations or the people to people bumping into each other. But when it comes to deep learning or machine learning, there is a more grave consequence to the society. And most probably there would be more repercussions. So we need to be ready for that discussion. Lastly, what I propose in terms of cooperation between the ROK and the EU, you may have seen in the news that in the South Korean apparatus, gender issues are pretty stark. And the GDPR has very good legal foundations on online child safety. I think there could be some avenue for discussion there in terms of legalization. And South Korea could benefit from the kind of European expertise and knowledge in developing such law. Plus, although South Korea also has a child protection law, it has to be more rigorous in terms of protection. That's what I mean. And technology-wise, in terms of 5G rollouts, in terms of artificial intelligence, there should be more technical cooperation here in this realm. So what does this mean for AI in the COVID-19 era? These are the founding members, currently excludes China, but these like-minded countries will sort of, have to come together and discuss what kind of global partnership is viable or not. Because as we've seen in this Corona app digital tracking system, everybody has a different idea. So I'll end it there. Any questions and comments, they can all be delivered to my email, and you could go through some of the other Corona projects that I've been doing you could discover them at my research web. Oh, by the way, this means thank you.
Oh, wonderful.
Thanks to all the frontline workers.
Wonderful, June. That's just a terrific presentation. It gives us an enormous number of lines of inquiry and discussion, and I thank you for that. But let's give Dr. Pardo from the Korea Foundation Chair at Brussels University an opportunity to make some comments, raise some questions first, and then we'll move into a more general discussion on the Q&A function of the webinar. So thank you again, Dr. Park, and Dr. Pardo, may I invite you please to make some comments.
Sure. Thank you very much for the presentation, and of course I have read the paper as well, which is on the East West Center website, which is also very good. I have 3 points to focus on with comments and questions really, so then we can open the floor to the audience. So I mean, your premise obviously is based, as you make clear towards the end, that there should be this conditional use of personal data in an emergency, and you emphasize the conditional component. There's also obviously a temporary component. This is during an emergency. It is not after an emergency. And you mentioned in the paper that there were some, as you say, right, misguided criticisms of the authoritarian component of this electronic tracing, not only on Korea, but other Asian countries that were using the same. And there was this debate in Europe. Are European societies ready to give up, so to speak, the data for the common good, right? Now, what we see in Europe is the debate has started to shift. There is also the debate about, well, is the trade-off that we need to have lockdowns again, that essentially mean that there is no freedom of movement, right? And that's the point that those who want electronic tracing are making, right? We have spent 2, 3, 4 months, depending on the country, in a lockdown. So we couldn't simply just go out and about, right? Because there was no tracing, but also because we were being told this is what you have to do. There's also the component of the damage to the economy that comes from lockdowns, and European economies are projected to do very poorly this year, far worse than Korea and other countries in East Asia. And there was also a debate from which we have moved on now, thankfully, I think, which is mask wearing, right? And for some people, mask wearing was the state telling us how we should be behaving, right? And now that debate is over, and now most people in Europe, if you look at the street, that masks are actually good. So I wanted to ask you to put this debate that there has been in Korea, that there was in Korea after 2015, about personal freedom vis-a-vis a degree of surveillance, right? How was this solved within Korea to make people accept that it is good to have temporary electronic tracing because the other options might not be appealing, because maybe without electronic tracing, maybe Korea would have a lockdown like the one we had in Europe, so people staying at home for 3 months, for example. So if you can expand on that later on. And the second point, and you raised it towards the end, but in your paper is more central, I guess, to your argument, which is this global partnership on artificial intelligence, which is very recent, as you say, as a month old, basically, from June 15th, where you have Korea and several European countries plus the EU being part of it, along with the US. Now, this comes in a context, obviously, in which there are many differences with regards to artificial intelligence, tech in general, not necessarily only with China, but for example, between the European and the US, right? There is a digital taxation component, GDPR that the US doesn't like too much. There are differences between most European countries and the US regarding Huawei, right? The UK is the outlier here because they have banned Huawei, but if you look at other European countries, Huawei, and France confirmed this, for example, a few days ago, they're going to be allowed to be part of the 5G networks in these countries. So in this context in which there are differences, even within the countries that are part of this global partnership, how do you think we can move forward on finding common ground between Korea, the European Union, European countries, the US, and other countries that are part of the initiative, right? You have India, Singapore, and New Zealand, for example, to find some international rules, I'm not even talking about law, but international rules that countries can be expected to follow, and that might even be appealing to China in the future, which is a country that, as you say, is not part of this. And one last aspect, I wanted to broaden your discussion about EU-Korea cooperation. You focus in tech, obviously, which is very important. And it is true that as a result of the pandemic, there is more discussion about how to cooperate with so-called like-minded partners, right? And Korea is a like-minded partner from a European perspective because it's a democracy, market economy, rule of law, etc., etc. And there is the tech component, there is a trade component. So for example, both Korea and the European Union helped to set up this WTO appellate body, right, in January, without the US in this case, for example. China was part of it. There's discussion about green growth initiatives and cooperation between the European and Korea with their respective green growth initiatives. Obviously, in pandemics, there is cooperation between the disease control centers in Korea and in the European Union. So I guess my question is twofold. A, can you expand a little bit more on where do you see the cooperation in the area of tech? But also, do you think that the COVID-19 crisis, and maybe even the trade war that they're witnessing at the global level, can bring more cooperation between the European and Korea, which between the two of them, you see very little frictions, right? Frictions are more between the US and China, between China and the European Union, between the US and the European Union as well. There is a trade war going on, but not really with Korea. So do you think that more cooperation is possible, or do you think, you know, that we need the big three to reach an agreement, the EU, the US, and China, and that's the way to move forward?
Great, thank you, Dr. Pardo. Before we go to the Q&A section and get questions from the YouTube folks who are watching live stream, let's give Dr. Park an opportunity to respond to Ramon's very interesting and useful points as well. Dr. Park, why don't you go first, and then we'll turn to the additional participants' questions and comments. Thank you.
So thank you, Ramon, for these invaluable comments. I think first and foremost, your questions and comments are very much on target with regard to what I've been thinking about in terms of Europe's perception, how Europe has gone through in this crisis, and how it was perceived from here, from the South Korean lens, because they've already gone through it before. Not a scale of this size, but something similar that was really had really shaken up the country. So about authoritarian residue, it's one of the reasons why I embarked on a series of coronavirus COVID-19 projects to sort of demystify or to sort of clarify that authoritarian residue is not actually the real reason, but rather public demand, and that political life expectancies are jeopardized if they cannot resolve the issue of pandemics in a country like South Korea now, because it's happened before, and it can really shake up the political atmosphere if they can't get this under control. So I have also witnessed some of the discussions, especially in France, and it was covered here as well, Guy Sorman's comment on Le Point, or even on Les Echos, a lot of discussions about, we are not willing to give up our freedom in the beginning. And I'm glad that you mentioned that the discussion has turned around a little bit to sort of accommodate how serious this is and what kind of changes have to be made in order to make this more easier for the rest of the people who are still alive. And mask wearing, every day I wake up and I see news from the US, it's just really appalling for me with regard to mask wearing guidelines. I think the experience of mayors basically brought about these masks as one of the fundamental, pivotal tools to combat. And although it takes up a little bit of your personal freedom, still it's worth it because you protect yourself, you protect other people. And the reason why all of this frenzy occurred was because the guidelines at the very beginning were wrong at the WHO. Even in the US, Dr. Anthony Fauci wanted to prioritize the delivery to the medical personnel. And I understand that there was a shortage of supply, but what we have seen on not believing that masks are fundamental, it was just so shocking from the South Korean perspective, because the virus travels in aerosol, and it was hugely disputed. If you read the mayor's white paper that came out in a couple of years after MERS, there was still a debate on whether it actually traveled by saliva. But what was very evident through this crisis is that it does. And because it does, masks are one of the cheapest, affordable, and protective ways to combat this crisis. And I'm glad that France has moved on to take on initiative in this regard as well. So tracking-wise, as I've shown in the institutional changes that have come about MERS, before and after MERS, and also this COVID-19 crisis, I think what was really pivotal in this regard for the South Korean context, which is probably not applicable to the European context, is that credit card possession rate is pretty high. It's almost like 90-something% in South Korea. And cell phones, there is almost no individual without a cell phone. And cell phones are basically, they play the role of social security in this regard. And that is big brothery, in my opinion, to be honest. But if it can help save lives, I think that's the basic social sort of perception or the decision. If you survey maybe 100 people, roughly about 80% would say, oh, I want this to be controlled, even if it means I have to give up a little bit of my personal freedom. So MERS was pivotal. That's something that we could really say. And then into the transatlantic realm, UK decision on Huawei ban, it's only until 2027. So it's still, you know, a lot to be answered. There's a lot to be answered with regard to how the UK would stick to this announcement. I am of the view that the UK has wanted to benefit from both China and the US, but for some reason on this occasion, because the US and the UK are going through negotiations right now, and the pressure is quite something, especially at a time when the UK is exiting the European Union. It needs the big chunk of a trading partner. So I think that, so things might change on that end as time goes by, but then, you know, other players such as Finland's Nokia could step in and deliver. There are many ways in which the UK would sort of replace Huawei's position in the UK 5G realm, but I do not think that we should completely rule it out, because we've seen so many you know, evolutions of this Huawei discussion in the UK. And France, yes, France is obviously, you know, in Paris, they have opened the showroom and factory building for Huawei. I think it has to do with the current leadership in line with commercial interests, and for Airbus as well. But we'll have to see how that unfolds, and perhaps this is a geopolitical game as well when it comes to trying to target the US tech companies and digital taxation issues at large. At the same time, you have China, which could be used as a leverage. You know, accepting China in some ways is a leverage for France. But how solid it could be as a leverage is the question. Then, some of the issues that, an important one that Ramon has raised. So can we go on? The tech cooperation realm is really, really challenging. Even with this GPAI, I am of the view that it may not really achieve something fruitful, sadly, because of the institutional variance that we see on the tech front. But there may be very, very fundamental things that we could protect, such as online child safety, sex trafficking online, and also when it comes to these COVID-19 tracking methods, there could be technological sharing, and it has been ongoing actually for the past few months. In terms of the tech sharing environment, I think there could be some leeway, but because there's a variety of answers that countries have come about offered in terms of COVID-19 tracking, and I'm not quite sure whether there could be something by the OECD standard. So on the WTO, this is very interesting, and you know, the interim appellate body, in the absence of the US participation, does it really mean something is my realist perspective, but of course there may be other opinions. So, you know, the society is changing so fast in ways that the WTO, the Marrakesh Agreement, or TRIMS could not really define in terms of regulation. And I think that that's one of the reasons why we're seeing these kinds of, you know, diverging attitude by the United States, wanting to construct other kinds of measures through USMCA or other bilateral trade agreements. And perhaps that's the kind of world that we have to live in the next coming decades. And global cooperation doesn't really ring a bell in this regard. That's sad.
Well, thank you, June and Ramon. I really thank you. You've had such a very extensive and rich discussion of lines. I do want to get to a couple of the Q&A questions because we only have 5 minutes left because we've
sorry.
covered such, no, it's okay, but we've just covered so much terrain. I do want to get at least 1 or 2 questions in. We have Dr. Mark Manat Menanton coming to us from Manila, Philippines, former US, Japan, Southeast Asia visiting fellow at the East-West Center, and now working on a range of issues based in Manila. He asked, Dr. Park, how do cultural social factors play into the social contract that you raised into, as exemplified by the Infectious Diseases Prevention and Management Act in the case of South Korea versus EU?
Well, so as I mentioned earlier on, this is the mayor's moment that South Korea had 5 years ago for Europe. And right now is the opportunity for Europe to think about whether they want a specific kind of a social contract written into law. And that is sort of the GDPR Article 6 revision that I was talking about. Member states need to voice their opinions based on public debate results that they have in each of their jurisdictions. And I think that's really, really critical because you need to deliver the voices of your people to sort of, you know, in a democratic system like the European Union, you need to be able to sort of represent that. But chances are at the EU level, things may not be gathered completely. It's 27 states. Chances are you may not have a complete consensus on everything. So I think one step forward to do this is to first engage in a domestic debate on whether, you know, it starts small from things like whether GPS data should be collected or not temporarily and then deleted. Because that's how the IDPCA, the Infectious Disease Prevention and Control Act, sort of embodied the ways of restricting personal freedom, you know, by utilizing that data for a short period of time and then deleting it after a number of days that was required. Yeah, sorry.
No, I want to give Ramon a chance too. I didn't need to interrupt you. Go ahead, June, please finish your thought. I just wanted to give Ramon a thought because he's based there in Brussels, so he might have some perspective on this question.
Let's hear from Ramon first, yeah.
Thank you. Ramon.
Yeah, I mean, that was a discussion in Europe towards the beginning, right? Are Europeans, Westerners, not used to things like wearing masks, or are they more individualistic, therefore they don't care as much for the group? I mean, I think that view has changed in Europe dramatically. I mean, as I said, the big change has been mask wearing. I mean, in the beginning it was like, well, that's something that we don't do over here, something that they do over there, right? So to speak, there meaning Korea and other Asian countries, right? And now it has completely changed, and it's going to be compulsory indoors, even in many indoors, but also outdoors in some cases in many countries, right? So I think that perception has changed, and it has more to do with having lived through the experience of tens of thousands of people basically dying, right? Because the right measures were not taken, and what can be learned from Korea. But I would agree that at the beginning there was this view that maybe society is different there in East Asia, therefore this won't happen in Europe. And now that view is really gone out of the window.
Yeah. Go ahead, June. Go ahead, June.
So on the social and cultural front, I think the wearing of hijabs in Europe, akin to sort of perceptions on masks, or you know, in the South Korean context, because masks were so common in terms of trying to shield oneself from the yellow dust from China, or, you know, domestically born fine dust. It was a very common behavior. And when you ride the subway here or public transportation, if you don't have a mask, you are not allowed to be on. And even before these regulations, I think a plethora of people, most of the people that you would see on public transport, they would be wearing a mask. So that's more of the social cohesion sort of behavior, that if you don't wear a mask, others will view you as irresponsible. And that's a very different kind of concept, I think, in societies where masks were shunned.
Well, I am very conscious that it's 10 o'clock here in the morning in Eastern Daylight Time, which means that it's several hours later in Brussels, and it's even later in South Korea. So I don't want to delay. I know it's late on a Friday evening for you, both in Brussels and in Seoul. So I fear we will have to draw this to a close. But I would say to all the panelists, both on Zoom call, almost 30, as well as on the live stream YouTube, I encourage you, please, to look at the PowerPoint on the YouTube live stream video that will be posted shortly after we get some editing done on the YouTube. Second, to look at the article that June published called in the Asia Pacific Bulletin on her presentation today, and to direct your questions both to Ramon and June, who are easily reachable as they've given their contact information. But I do want to say, in the spirit of the 60 Minutes for the 60th anniversary of the East-West Center programming here, thank you to have such wonderful return performance of Dr. June Park, our former Asia Studies visiting fellow. And I almost feel like Ramon is an alumnus because we're working so closely together on a number of projects, and he's kindly agreed to participate in this presentation, work with us on an upcoming report on EU ROK-US interactions, which I hope you'll stay tuned, and we'll have Ramon back to discuss that in one format or another, hopefully in person, but at a minimum on webinar. So again, I wish all participants well for the coming weekend, and thank you. Stay healthy, and to our presenters, please join me in thanking them, and stay tuned to our future programs. Sarah has given a web link to our future upcoming programs. Thank you very much indeed, and good day.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.